All right, over to you, Tim.
Thanks much, Vaibhav. Let me grab screen 2. If you could please confirm that you see my PowerPoint deck.
I can see it.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you. Hey, everybody. So happy to be with you again. We're going to learn about Azure Monitor and KQL, Kusto Query Language. You know, preliminarily, I just want to say, Sammy from Harbinger reminded me of just how valuable these tech user groups are. I mean, obviously, you all know because you're attending one, but I'm such an evangelist of these tech user groups because if you're between jobs or just entering the industry, I've found in my career that professional networking has been the source of just about every placement I've ever had, full-time, part-time, contract, and that even extends to my current role at Microsoft, as a matter of fact. So I want you to know that I work at Microsoft Learn. I tend the Azure governance documentation, so I'm attached to a few engineering teams, primarily Azure policy and management groups, taxonomic tags, that kind of stuff. But I also want you to know I'm here on my own behalf because I want to be. I'm not here on behalf of my employer. So what have I prepared for you? I figured I've got about 45, I mean, I could go any length of time, but I figured I'd go for about 45 minutes or so in terms of showing you some slides, doing some hands-on practical demo. But any and all questions that you have, like Vaibhav said, start to populate them in the chat, and I'll make sure to leave lots of time at the end devoted to Q&A. The sky's the limit. I normally like to start with just a little bit of foundational information to make sure we're all on the same conceptual page. So, you know, relevant vocabulary, relevant Azure products that focus on monitoring. We'll look at the Azure monitoring workflow, at least my own personal interpretation of an Azure monitoring workflow. And I'll make sure to do lots and lots and whole bunches of hands-on demos so we're not just looking at slides for 45 or 50 minutes. Okay, session materials, right. So if you point your browser to timw.info, omam, O-M-A-M, that stands for Omaha Azure Monitoring, that will be a direct download link to a PDF version of the slide deck. So timw.info, O-M-A-M. If one of you would be so kind as to pop that short link into the chat, I'd really appreciate that. Also, you'll find that in the corner of most of the slides, I have a link that goes to an appropriate article at Microsoft Learn. So if there's something that spurs your interest on a particular slide, there's at least a starting point there. Although, you know, if you're like me, as a working IT professional, Google is my best friend. I should say Bing, I understand that, but I have too much cognitive and muscle memory with Google. So foundational concepts, I'm borrowing from Microsoft Learn, as you can see. And again, the attribution URLs are in the lower corner. Not to belabor the theory, but again, I want to make sure that we're coming from a consistent, cohesive place. In the middle of this diagram, we have the two main monitoring streams coming into Azure Monitor. This is according to Microsoft. On one hand, we've got our metrics. Microsoft defines metrics as numeric data, time-sampled numeric data. Easy examples would be things like CPU utilization on a virtual machine, requests per second coming into a Cosmos DB account, stuff like that, numerically quantified data. And that, of course, makes it easier, not easy, to monitor because we can develop a baseline of our performance over time and then alert when we've identified acceptable thresholds. Logs refers, I like to define it in two slightly different ways. One would be a way to persist metrics. You'll find that a lot of Azure resources will allow you not only to look at live numeric metrics, but to surface those permanently and then analyze them in a persistent form. But then logs also capture events. An event would be, I would define it as a lightweight notification of a state change. In Azure, for example, if somebody stops and deallocates a virtual machine, that's a pretty high priority event, it seems to me. That's going to be captured in one or more logs somewhere. But the complexity comes in. How do we onboard not only our Azure infrastructure to begin to get some insight, some remote measurement, some telemetry of our Azure infrastructure, but what about our applications? Your developers are certainly going to want to see what's going on inside your application source code. So there's infrastructure in Azure, there's Azure applications and application performance monitoring. But you might have noticed that a big trend in Azure over the last few years has been embracing multi-cloud, hybrid cloud. So we think about using Azure Monitor as a central point for monitoring not just our Azure cloud stuff, but also if we've done multi-cloud and we have redundant solutions in, say, Amazon or Google Cloud, we want to onboard them, and certainly in our local data centers. So we have all these various and sundry data sources. Once we have the metrics and logs coming into Azure Monitor, we'll see in a moment, I'm really talking about Log Analytics Workspace. Over on the right, we have all of our different outputs, stuff that we can do to make sense of that data. What is our goal here? Well, the way I like to describe it is back in the old days, going to and from work through the snow, uphill both ways, when there was physical servers all over the place. I know that that's still the case for many businesses now, but you've got full stack control of the environment, don't you? With Azure, you're not going to get within miles or kilometers of the data center. You'll never know real details about the hardware underlying your services. So any telemetry we can get is going to be useful. That's my point. So let's see, continuing on. A term that you should know going forward for this session and beyond is the workbook. What's that? The workbook, as you can see on this slide, is meant to be, in a sense, like a Power BI report. It's a collection of graphical visualizations that are based either on metric or log data, coincidentally or not. The source code for these is JSON. You can actually go out to GitHub and look at hundreds of samples that you can import into your Azure environment. We'll see all this hands-on momentarily. But the big thing about the workbooks that I want to transmit is that you can get a flying head start on your Azure infrastructure and application monitoring by looking at some of the built-in default workbooks that Microsoft gives you right out of the gate, because those are curated by Microsoft specifically based on the most popular support requests and customer requests, you see. So it answers the question that so many people have. Okay, we're going into the cloud. I know that we've got this trust thing, this cloud responsibility model, and we're going to not have anywhere near the degree of control over our environment that we do when we own it. What can we look for? What should we look for? Is it just like perfmon, how we monitor our local Windows servers? This is a good flying head start to get a picture of what are the most important metrics and log searches. Okay, log analytics is, we could look at it, I think of it as an Apache, an Apache Spark cluster. If you're familiar at all with big data analytics, the idea with the log analytics workspace is you've got this compute cluster. Of course, it's under the hood. You're never going to interact with it directly, but this massively scalable compute layer with some proprietary query engine built on top of it. Microsoft doesn't have many of those details published. We don't need to worry about it. Long story short, we can send as many of those log data sources as we want into the workspace. And it really doesn't matter what the format of those logs are, if they're XML or JSON or CSV or binary. As long as Log Analytics understands what the log file is, it'll rationalize or convert them into tables, just like a SQL database with columns and data types. And then we've got this query language called Kusto, K-U-S-T-O. I hope this color for my highlight's not too bad. Let me see if I can quickly fix it. I'm colorblind myself, but it seems kind of bright on my eyes. Let me quickly see if I can choose another color. How about that? I don't know what that is, but we'll take a look. See if I can close this. Okay. Yeah, so we're obviously going to be spending time with Kusto because this gives us intelligence across potentially, as I said, not just Azure, but across your hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environment. So that's the high-level picture. You start by creating a log analytics workspace. We onboard data sources into the workspace, and then comes you flexing your KQL muscles, because that's going to unlock all of your monitoring capabilities. Specifically, in my opinion, the most powerful things you can do with Kusto in your Azure Monitor monitoring is creating alerts based on logs. Because you could do something like, remember the log4j vulnerability? You could write a Kusto query, for instance, that says, go across all of my servers, not just in Azure, but in other clouds and on premises, and look for the presence of these markers or these files. And we can do with these tables, it functions very much like a relational database. In your Kusto, you can join tables together based on matching columns. So you can aggregate, show me all of the machines that are vulnerable for log4j and blah, 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 or this other. You can get as targeted as you want with these queries. And then we can configure an alert in Azure such that Azure will run the query essentially on a loop. And then we might configure it such that if it returns greater than 0 rows, that would fire the alert and it would go into an active state. And then we could do things like not just notifying the appropriate people, but we could configure more complex workflows like triggering a logic app or a function or an automation runbook. You see? All right, here's an example of Kusto query language. Now, some interesting history about KQL. This whole idea of log analytics started its life with something called Data Explorer that's still used internally at Microsoft, and it's available in the Azure portal. You can actually create your own Azure Data Explorer clusters for big data analytics purposes. And so it was an idea for Microsoft internally to look at huge data sets without having to wait hours like you might with a Hadoop cluster. And they developed this query language from scratch as a way to write an approachable data access language that would be immediately familiar to people who, for instance, know SQL, structured query language, that might know PowerShell or Bash shell scripting, that might know other monitoring platforms. You'll find that this query language looks a lot like the Splunk query language. It looks a lot like the Amazon CloudTrail log search language. And I think that's intentional. So what you can see just in this sample, the way it works, the high-level skeleton of Kusto is that you've got the capacity to comment, which is super important in practice when you're sharing your queries with your colleagues so they know what the heck it does, because some of them can be enormous, So we've got C# style comments. We've got keywords, some of which might call to mind other programming and scripting languages like let, for instance, JavaScript type keyword. We can create variables and reference variables in our queries. But fundamentally, what's common to every Kusto query is that you start with one of those virtual tables. You know how I said that when you're pointing your resources into your workspace, those logs get surfaced as these quasi-relational data tables. You've got a reference to one of those, and then you build out your clauses using just the pipe character. And you can run a Kusto query just as a one-liner, or you can format it. It's like JSON in as much as that you can have as much white space as you want or blank space as you want. Where functions in Kusto just like it does in SQL, where you can do row-level filtering. Some keywords in Kusto are different. Like in SQL, you've got select. Project is the analogous keyword in Kusto. You can do table joins on a common column, just like I mentioned before. And then there's more that we'll take a look at. So that's just a teaser there. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say about the history here that I think is kind of interesting. That this word Kusto is a joke, really. It's kind of funny because Jacques Cousteau, the late great French oceanographer, you know how he discovered the seas and the underseas? I remember as a kid watching his TV documentaries. When you think of it, Cousteau, Cousteau. So it's intentional that Cousteau is a callback to Jacques Cousteau, because the idea with Kusto query language is we're doing data exploration. I hope all that makes some semblance of sense. Well, let's get rocking here. Let me buzz through a couple more slides and we'll get into demo. The general Azure monitoring workflow, according to me anyway, would look something like this. Again, making sure you've got one or more workspaces. Why would you have more than one log analytics workspace? Well, partitioning your environment. Fun fact, if any of you are familiar with Sentinel, Microsoft Sentinel, the SIM SOAR, the security orchestration platform, Sentinel uses log analytics as its data layer. So you would have very likely one or more infrastructure log analytics workspaces and one or more maybe Sentinel workspaces. Again, thinking of data partitioning. I'm going to show you these Azure Monitor Insights modules that are, again, a way to help businesses and people who may not know what to look for in their Azure environment off the bat. It's just meant to be an accelerator, a solution accelerator. I'm going to show you how we can configure diagnostic settings, making sure that preferably we're enabling diagnostics settings at deployment in our deployment templates. For application developers, there's App Insights, and there's a point of confusion that I want to make sure to iron out. What is the relationship between App Insights and log analytics? And frankly, if you're not a developer, you might wonder exactly what Application Insights is. So we've got that. And I also want to make sure you're familiar with the alerting platform, just because it's so incredibly powerful. Lastly, this shows just some sample code, a couple ways that we can enable diagnostic settings. What are we doing when we're enabling diagnostic settings? Well, you're basically choosing what metrics and logs you want to collect from the Azure resource, and then you're determining what destinations you want to send that data to, with us focusing on a log analytics workspace. And on the left, we have some sample Azure command line interface or CLI code, where we've got in the AZ monitor context, this diagnostic settings create command where you can pass it in. I mean, I'd love to have a side conversation with all of you about your opinions on Azure CLI. I really would, because there seems to be, well, I'm not going to get off track, but anyway, that's some pretty gnarly looking CLI code, but if you've got it already written out, you can run it as many times as you want without failure, fingers crossed. On the right side, we have a bicep template extract that shows creating a diagnostic settings resource. Again, the point's not to understand every line, but hopefully thinking in terms of infrastructure as code and trying to do things like setting up log collection right out of the gate at deployment and having it in your deployment scripts. That's the point I'm trying to drive home here. All right, Arino. Vaibhav, any questions in the chat that you'd like to surface at this point?
Yes, there is one. Mike is asking, what is the scoping guidance for deploying Azure Log Analytic workspaces per subscription, resource group, other, etc.?
Okay. Well, in answering that question, let's take a step back and understand those management scopes. You know, you've got your individual resource, let's say a storage account, and that storage account is always going to be contained within a resource group. That resource group is going to roll up to a subscription, how we're paying for our usage. Optionally, you've got your management group for businesses that have multiple subscriptions and want to do governance easier. And then at the very top of the hierarchy, we have our Azure Active Directory tenant. Now, it's important to know that the Log Analytics workspace, although it's regional, that is, it's placed within regional data centers, which is unfortunate, actually. It's important for you to understand that you can onboard resources from anywhere in the world. So it's not like if you've worked with recovery services vaults, if you were looking to protect machines with backup or replication, there's a hard limit. You have to have your Azure VMs in the same region as the vault. It's not the case. So you can have, if you want to, one Log Analytics workspace that collects data from all the subscriptions, because the Log Analytics resides at the tenant scope. And you're going to see that in just a minute. Now, what is Microsoft's official guidance? I'm pretty positive they don't give one size fits all guidance as far as that goes. I like the fact that it sits up at the very top of the management hierarchy, because it gives you at least potentially as much scope as you want. Now, your point is well taken if you're thinking of security. Remember, we've got role-based access control, and because the Log Analytics workspace is a first-class citizen in Azure Resource Manager, you can protect access that is the readers and so on, of log analytics workspaces using RBAC roles. So that having been said, as you can see, I'm in the portal. Let me go over to log analytics, and we've got our workspaces here. And I've got one that I've had for quite a while. Let's just quickly take a look at the creation workflow to see if anything interesting pops up. So like I said, it is a regional resource. Now, what are some implications of a regional versus a global resource? Well, if the region goes dark, then you're in trouble, aren't you? It's unfortunate, but anyway, yeah, it's a regional resource. The other thing about log analytics is pricing, and I'm so grateful. I normally, when I'm teaching a CERT course especially, I love saying, pricing's not in scope, so we're not going to cover it. Because who likes to talk about and get into the weeds when it comes to pricing? Historically, the way log analytics workspace pricing works is that there's a free tier that has limited data retention. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 week of data retention. And then there's a volume cap where you can ingest a certain number. It used to be, I think, 5 gigs a month, something like that. Now, even when you're using a paid tier for the log analytics workspace, you should know that there still is a data retention limit. It's 2 years. But the interesting thing about this is that recently, in the last handful of months, there's now a capacity to do an automatic data archival. And so you can configure, I haven't played with it myself yet, but somewhere in the log analytics workspace settings, you can configure a long-term retention policy so that when your log data is getting close to where it would otherwise be purged, if you need to, for compliance reasons, for example, to keep that data indefinitely, you can configure the workspace to auto-archive it into a storage account, and then it'll set it in the blob service of the storage account using the archive access tier, which gives you a deep price discount. I think that's pretty cool, because historically I've seen solutions where people have created, say, a logic app to when data in a log analytics workspace gets ready to time out, it archives it manually. Another thing we can do actually is when you do your diagnostic settings, as you'll see in a moment, one of the destinations actually is a storage account. But that has the limitation of is it doesn't automatically put the blob container in archive mode, which gives you that deep discount. So let's take a look at the workspace that I have up and running. So once you've got a workspace created, what next? Where do you want to go next? What I normally show is we can come down under settings. Actually, let's go down further. If we go down under workspace data sources, you can easily onboard your Linux and Windows virtual machines into the workspace from here. I mean, you know how Microsoft products work. There's 5 or 6 different ways to accomplish any task. This is just one. But you see here, I've got a Windows machine that's currently connected to another workspace. Is that a problem? No, it really isn't, honestly. Bottom line is this will enumerate all virtual machines across all subscriptions that trust this tenant. Remember, the log analytics workspace has visibility, has scoping at the very top. So we're able to go across regions, subscriptions, resource groups. And in the GUI here, we can just come in here. For instance, I can disconnect my instructor VM from whatever workspace it was reporting to. And then once this finishes, I can click connect. And what happens? Well, all this is doing is just giving us a graphical front end where Azure will load or install the Azure Monitor agent on that particular machine. Now, you can do that manually as well. You don't have to come in through here by any stretch. In best case, I'm going to keep repeating it, you've configured the machine to onboard into log analytics at deployment time in your deployment script. With Windows, it's interesting that the monitor agent surfaced, historically it surfaced as an old control panel. The latest version of the agent, I honestly don't remember if it's still an old-fashioned control panel or not. I need to check that actually. But the thing to know about that with Windows machines is that you open the agent on the machine, And you not only can confirm that you're reporting to the correct workspace, you can actually multi-home that Windows virtual machine. So for instance, if you had a VM in AWS or on premises, or if it's an Azure VM, again, it doesn't matter. You can use that control panel to add in another registration into another log analytics workspace. It's called multi-homing, and historically that's not been available for Linux machines. I still think it isn't, but I'm not 100% sure on that. You'd have to look into the docs. But that could be useful, for instance, because you might have a server that needs to report both to your infrastructure log analytics workspace, as well as, say, your Microsoft Sentinel security workspace. So that multi-homing capability is important. You should also know that the log analytics service uses traditional web protocols, the TCP 443 TLS dance. And that's important from a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud standpoint. You can look under here in the workspace settings. We've got agents management and then legacy agents management. Let's just go to agents management. Long story short, you can easily onboard Linux and Windows machines and other clouds or on premises simply by downloading the agent if it shows up. There we go. And there should be a download link here somewhere. Azure Monitor Windows agent, and then there's some instructions. There we go. So what you'll need is, besides the MSI package or the Debian package, whatever, when you load the software on the remote machine, you'll specify the GUID, the Globally Unique ID workspace ID of the workspace, and either of these keys. Just like any other API key, you want to keep those keys secret. I'm going to need to regenerate those after the session today, as a matter of fact, because it's like any other RESTful service. If you're using an API key and that key leaks and they know your endpoint, you're in trouble. Now, I mentioned that as long as Log Analytics understands the log format that's coming into it, you're good. It'll just automatically create tables. And that's powerful because when you think of all of the additional services available, not just in Azure, but across the entire Microsoft Cloud platform, that means you can surface all of that intelligence in one spot here, because Log Analytics knows, for example, how all of the logs and metrics are collected, say, in the Defender suite, the Microsoft 365 suite, all of those platforms. Or within Azure, if you've used things like the Update Management solution and the Anti-Malware solution, you can bring all of that log richness directly in without any modification. The Log Analytics workspace will build those tables automatically. Now, what if you've got applications, maybe homegrown apps, where your developers have created custom log streams? You now want to surface intelligence from those log streams as well. That's what this interface is giving you an entry point into, and there's some great articles at Microsoft Learn on how to do custom logs. It's really not too difficult at all. You're just going to basically define the schema or the structure of your log and make sure that the agents, that Log Analytics is collecting the custom logs data, and you're good to go. Speaking of which, you can see here under agents, I guess it's collapsed. It used to be that there were two separate settings, one for onboarding the agents and then doing your data collection. It looks like now that's been collapsed into a new UI. But basically, if you go into data collection rules, this is where you can dig in and make sure that you're collecting maybe not every Windows log, like the event log system, but there may be key ones besides the standard ones like security and audit and all that you want to collect. With Linux, you've got this, what is it? Is it syslog? Those type of data sources. So that just, I don't want to belabor the point. So that's what we've got going on here. Let's see. I think that's good for that for now. Let's next head on over to Azure Monitor. And one idea of Azure Monitor here is to give you an all-in-one workspace for your infrastructure and application monitoring. So up at the top here, we have the foundational parts and pieces of Azure Monitor, starting with Activity Log. Now, what is Activity Log? Well, when you think about it, Azure Resource Manager is a REST API. It's a RESTful service. You can do create, read, update, and delete requests using the HTTP protocol. Every one of those requests is going to be captured here at the subscription level in your activity log. So this is a place where you can see who did what when, did that request succeed or fail, and it allows you to dip in there, and if you really want to look at as much data as possible, you can, but the downside to activity log is that, as you can see, to get to the details, you're hand parsing JSON. Who wants to do that? So it's important to point out, and it says it right up here, that in log analytics, you can surface your activity log across all your subscriptions and use single Kusto queries to go across all of your subscription level activity logs. So this is fine, but this is more or less a legacy view. If you're really going all in with log analytics and KQL, I would recommend you do that instead. Alerts we'll talk about more momentarily. For now, or for starters, I just want to make a point here that you've got your alert definitions, which give you what signal logic you're looking to trigger the alert on, etc. But then you have a separate Azure resource that governs the response. And what's nice about those action groups is that you can reuse them. So you might have one that just does simple email or text message notification to a particular team or collection of teams. And then you can modularly plug those action groups into different alert definitions. Here's our metrics explorer, which is fine if you know what you're looking for. That's the trick. It asks you at what scope do you want to look? Do you want to look at the subscription level and go down from there? Do you want to go down into a resource group and pick a particular resource? And once you've picked that particular resource, you can access the metrics that are enabled for that resource. Again, this is all going to be time-sampled numeric data. Now, this is nice, again, if you know what you're looking for, because you can quickly plot whatever metric it is, and you can adjust the time grain. But what I want you to see that you might or might not have noticed is that you can build an alert rule much more conveniently, I think, by plotting the metric here and then going into alert rule, because a lot of it's already filled in for you. It's a nice convenience. You can also do what's called splitting, where if the metrics are too broad, you can start to sub-partition them down from there. It's nice, but again, the Achilles heel here is that it's assumed that you know what metric it is that you're looking for. That's where these insights modules really begin to shine. Now, all of these insights modules are broken down by different workloads, as you can see, applications, VM, storage. This list started off relatively small, and it just gets longer and longer to the point where now there's a separate entry here called Insights Hub. And I predict that eventually there'll be so many workloads, all you'll see in Monitor is an Insights Hub link, because there's so many of these. What are these? Well, number one, they all rely upon log analytics, so you're going to want to make sure to have your workspace set up. Number two, the first time you go into one of these insights modules, there'll normally be some kind of onboarding process, as you can see, and almost, want to say always, not almost always. Always it's going to be when you onboard, where is your log analytics workspace? So once you've got that going, what you'll find is that these are Microsoft curated workbooks that give you a series of visualizations based on customer data and feedback and support requests of what Microsoft thinks are the most important metrics and log searches to look at least initially. So for virtual machines, for example, let me see if this looks like I haven't turned it on yet, darn it. But the workbook has multiple pages to it. Let me see if we can at least see. There's nothing here, unfortunately. But, to just see at a glance what's going on. Here's somewhat of an example where it's showing us top charts and aggregate charts here. Based on, for VMs, it's the most common performance metrics, isn't it? Like CPU utilization, available memory, data bytes sent and received, logical disk space used. That makes sense. And these are just basically metrics graphs. Let me see if I can find one that has different types of visualizations on it. Yeah, okay, this is a bit better. If we look at the storage accounts insights, So the idea here is that you may have who knows how many storage accounts that you're responsible for. As you can see, this particular visualization allows you to see in this particular one, we can see latency metrics, we can see transaction loads and historical transactions over time, errors on the client side. Looks like there's nothing else on there. You'll find that these workbooks are often multi-page. So it looks like the Storage Accounts Insights module has a capacity page. This could be useful indeed because one of the things we're paying for with our storage accounts is the data volume that you've got in Azure. So once this loads, it should show me at a glance of my 5 storage accounts how much data I've got in each one. You getting the idea? And so that motif or that paradigm goes through all of these individual workbooks. I hope you find that bit of information helpful. I haven't come close to being competent with creating my own workbooks. I want to give you a heads up. A friend of mine at Microsoft, and before he came to Microsoft and I came to Microsoft, Billy York, cloudsma.com is his blog. He's got some great stuff in there for workbooks and actually KQL and Azure Monitor and the whole thing. In fact, I noticed just today, he's got an article here called Azure Monitor Alert Workbook. And he shares all of his stuff that he works on. So we can see here there's a GitHub link to his GitHub. His GitHub is SC Automation. And if I take a look at the workbook definition, as I told you, it's just a JSON file. It's really gnarly looking. But it describes the different visualizations and so on and so forth. So that's something that you might want to dig into. Lastly, I will say that if you look up here under workbooks, there's a gallery of built-in workbooks that every customer gets where you can just take a look. Looks like they've got a lot of the same workloads that are in the insights list. You can clone these workbooks so you don't have to start from scratch. When you've opened a workbook, you can put it in edit mode. And what you'll see when you go under the hood with these workbooks is that they're always going to be one of n number of built-in visualizations. And part of it reminds me of Power BI, where you want to choose the best visualization based on the questions that you're looking to answer. This one's using a honeycomb that would fill in. If I had 100 VMs, it would be a pretty big honeycomb, but I can see CPU utilization at a glance. And if I click edit, you'll find that these visualizations are either going to be based on metrics or logs. So again, that foundational stuff I gave you at the beginning was very well intentioned because it's stuff that feeds all through the rest of our discussion and work. Now, let me come down to the bottom of Azure Monitor under Diagnostic Settings, because this answers the question. All right, I've got a bunch of Azure resources deployed. In my case, it's mostly storage accounts. But you can see here that the Diagnostic Settings list in Monitor allows you to filter based on your subscription, resource group, etc. And you can see at a glance which services have or have not been enabled for diagnostics. So in order to see anything with your Kusto querying, you're going to need to make sure that those resources are onboarded. I showed you how to onboard virtual machines. Let me now show you how to create a diagnostic setting for any other Azure resource. Let me see if I've got anything. Let's say I want to gather resources on my Key Vault. You create, I'm going to grab the name of the Key Vault, because when you create a diagnostic setting, you have to give it a name. Now you're going to find that some Azure resources surface metrics only, others surface logs only, and this one surfaces both. Now you can go into the docs to try to find out exactly what metrics are captured. We also can discover that via Kusto momentarily. But I'm going to select all metrics, and then for logs, it looks like we've got audit and all logs. And if we choose all logs, it selects audit logs. And again, that would be something, unfortunately, this is not very descriptive specifically what it's capturing. I would go further into the docs or in our Kusto. Now, if we look over on the right here, and this is true for all of your diagnostic settings configuration, you can send to any combination of these details. The way I like to differentiate them is as follows. For daily monitoring, Here we have our log analytics workspace. Done and done. For long-term archival, if you're not going to configure long-term policies in your log analytics workspace, you could kick it old school and do this and specify that you want the diagnostic settings to go into a storage account as well. Again, the blob container or containers that the diagnostic settings used will not be using archive, so you'll have to take care of setting the access tier manually. But that's that option, long-term archival. And then there's stream to an event hub. What would you use this for? Well, this would be, for example, used for if you've got events coming out of a resource that may be more sensitive or may require immediate action. You can, instead of having the data go into log analytics and then the next time somebody runs a query notices, oh, wait a minute, you can have the data as it's emitted going into an event hub, and then you can trigger whatever function, an API, whatever, you can trigger that based on data showing up in an event hub. So that allows you to capture data as it's streamed live and take action on it. So that in a nutshell is the background about diagnostic settings. Why didn't it like that? It gave me an error of some kind. It's already used, and I already have a diagnostic setting defined for the key vault. Okay, well, I just wanted to show you the process if you haven't seen it before. Now let's get into the good stuff with Kusto, shall we? How do you access a Kusto editor? Is there a VS Code extension? Is there some external editor? You know what? I really haven't found one, to be honest. I mean, I use VS Code every day. The closest I found to a KQL language editor for VS Code is an extension called Cuscus, K-U-S, VS Code extension. And this gives you some language support for KQL from within VS Code, but I really don't have a good solution. I'm actually all ears if anybody has a good solution outside of using the portal itself. Of course, in the Azure portal, you can find the logs blade at the resource level. You can find it at the log analytics workspace level. You can find it here in Azure Monitor. It's just going to be a case of what your scope is. So this is asking you, how big of a data sink are you looking to query? And because we're in Azure Monitor, it has no idea, so it's showing everything, subscriptions and resource groups and so on and so forth. I'm going to select Omaha RG as my resource group, and that would limit the data set that I'm querying to just what's contained in that resource group. Now, would that presumably give us faster results? Maybe. You could try benchmarking it. Now, of course, I haven't onboarded those resources into log analytics yet. So it says no data found, so it doesn't have any tables. So I'm kind of dead in the water here. Now I want to share a resource that you might find really, really helpful. In fact, I want to share two resources that I think are going to give you maybe the fastest, actually the shortest time to, I'm sorry, my brain's short-circuiting. Time to productiveness, if that's a term. One would be this short link here. Look at the slide, aka.ms/la-demo, aka.ms/la-demo. That will take you into the Azure portal. So be prepared to sign in with your Azure AD account or your Microsoft account. It doesn't matter. What that is the KQL query playground. So it takes you into a Microsoft subscription. I'll go there right now, aka.ms/la-demo, and it gives you free read-only access to one of Microsoft's public access test dev log analytics workspaces. And you can verify it by looking at the scope designator here. When it shows up, you can see it's demo. So this has a whole bunch of sample data already loaded, so it's a great opportunity to start to kick the tires. And you can see here under tables, we can group these in a number of different ways: solution, category, or resource type. And you can see that in the data set, the sample data set, Microsoft has already onboarded a lot of the extra add-ons like Active Directory Health Check, the container insight stuff for container workflows and AKS. So there's a fair amount of data to work with here. And like I said, if you just want to look at, is there anything here for, say, app gateways? I need to monitor my app gateway. What's available there? Or if I've got a Bastion host, for instance, looks like there's an audit logs capability here. Again, all of these are log data sources that are being converted into that table type structure. And you'll notice here that if it's a log type that Log Analytics recommends, recognizes, there may be more info here. This is pretty bare, actually. Sometimes you'll get a description with more than just one sentence. This one at least tells you it's audit logs for Azure Bastion. And look here that there's a doc link that'll take us out into MS-Docs/Microsoft Learn that gives you some more detail on specifically what's in that table. So this doc set, let me scroll up to the top, under Azure Monitor Reference, Logs, Index, and that's going to be your canonical place to go to look up such and so table as you're researching and trying to figure out what is the log that I'm actually looking to query with my KQL. All right, so again, time to impact. I mentioned I wanted to give you 2 resources. Another resource here is built right into the portal log search here. There's a library of built-in queries, again, based on customer feedback. So, you should find them to be generally pretty handy. The downside to these I found is that some of them are old. And like any other DevOps team, the folks that do KQL revise the language from time to time, so you might find a query that breaks. Let's look under Azure Virtual Desktop here. Active sessions on session host. I don't know if there'd be anything actually running in this demo environment, but let's check it out. If we hover over the table, we can load that sample query into the editor. Adjust the split bar a little bit more. Hello. There we go. And let's see, to run the query, we can just hit it and go. Yeah, so it didn't like that. We can adjust the time range a couple ways. We can use the graphical tools here, or we can edit the KQL directly. You'll notice here that you can render tabular data as well as graphical data. That's potentially very convenient and useful indeed. Looks like there's no AVD stuff in the data set. I wouldn't expect that there would be, but you know what there probably is? There's probably lots of VM stuff. So let's take a look at some virtual machine output here. All events in the past hour. Well, that makes sense. Let's load that into an editor. In the Azure portal, the KQL editor uses a multi-tab motif, as you can see here, so you can bring out different tabs. And let me try that again. Let me bring that out and load that into a separate tab. You can have multiple queries in a single tab, but you'll want to make sure to select the query before you hit run. Kind of like SQL Server Management Studio when you're selecting SQL code. Wow, this isn't giving me any love here at all. What the heck is going on here? Let me change that ago to in the last 48 hours. Let's see. How about I do something like 2,000 hours? I'm really batting 1,000 here, aren't I? Wonderful. Well, the idea here is that you're getting your results back down on the results list, and it'll give you some metrics, how long the query took, etc. There'll be a column picker where you can pick which columns you want to see in your results. Let me do chart CPU usage trends. Let me load that into the editor. Select the query. Let's see if that's going to give us anything. I think it did. Come on. Yeah. Okay, well, it gave us way too much info. I'm trying to get that split bar. Come on, I've got evidently some latency happening. Or it's actually locked up my browser. Yeah, well, you can see that graphic. There we go. Whew. Yeah, that's pretty gnarly. We would certainly want to do maybe some wheres, maybe some summarization, etc., to clean that up and look at maybe a single machine. What I do sometimes during a demo is that I'll try to find a particular machine. It says the computer here is retail VM 01. Okay, so to clear this up, let's bring our query editor back up. This again is a very simple tweak to the query that I'm going to make. I'm going to say where computer name. Now you'll find here that the portal KQL editor is very fast. The auto, I will give it that. The autocomplete is really, really fast. Retail VM, was it 1 or 01? I don't remember what it was, to be honest with you. Hello. Slowness is getting on my nerves. Okay, yeah. So we're getting closer. You see what we're talking about here? So what we're looking at is the learning curve, the traditional learning curve where the initial load, time to impact, if your experience is like mine, let's put it that way, is low because you're exploring what tables are relevant for your use case. Remember how important it is to share. I mean, you've got the ability to share a link to a query. You can share it with your colleagues. You can just grab the data from a query as comma-separated value format. You can bring it down as an Excel book. Of course, it's grayed out because we're in the demo environment, not our own environment. And also importantly, you can bring this query out using that M Power Query format, where you can load it into Power BI and you can run the query and create any number of visualizations in Power BI if you use Power BI. So those are some of the things there. I hope that was helpful for you. The queries, and you can also get to the sample queries up here. And in this drop down over on the right, there's a link to a Pluralsight course, a couple of them actually, that are pretty good, although they're a bit old now. Another site that we use at Microsoft internally that I like to evangelize is called kustoking.com, K-U-S-T-O king.com. This is a really well done site because what the person does, he or she, I don't know the author yet, they've organized their tutorials by skill level, as you can see. They've done Kusto by type, and then by product is really important. I want to take a moment to mention how pervasive Kusto is, because if you're like me, you're thinking about, do I really have to learn another language? You know, I'm already horsing around with Bicep now with my deployments. I use PowerShell, and that was hard one. It took me a long time to get competent with that. Why do I have to learn this Kusto? Is it just for Azure infrastructure monitoring? The answer to that is absolutely not. Remember I mentioned application insights for your application performance monitoring? Guess what App Insights uses as its log search language? Kusto. And as you can see here, Azure Sentinel, Kusto. All of the Defender and Microsoft 365 products, Kusto. Even within Azure, you know, when you run your searches here on the search bar, the technology behind that is called Azure Resource Graph. Resource Graph is something that I think you should know about as well, because it allows you to, again, use Kusto, another perfectly good use case here. It's useful for doing inventorying. It's a really fast way to report on your Azure infrastructure. And the Resource Graph Explorer, as you can see here in the portal, includes somewhere a collection. Here we go. If we scroll down, there's a collection of example queries down here, all that have to do with inventory data. Like here's one that's useful, show unassociated network security groups. So I want you to think about looking at Resource Graph as another way to leverage Kusto for more or less housekeeping tasks. Maybe you're looking to do some cost savings and cost optimization. Show me all public IP addresses that aren't currently associated with a network interface, for instance. Or maybe from, you know, a security housekeeping standpoint, this query to show all unassociated network security groups might work. And as you can see, it's the Resource Graph Explorer is very similar to the standard KQL Explorer that we looked at momentarily. You can render as chart or table. You can download as CSV. It's if nothing else, worth looking at. Coming back again for app dev stuff, application insights. I mentioned that I wanted to straighten out a potential confusion regarding this resource. The idea here is that you create an App Insights resource. This is supposed to be a light bulb, by the way. And then your developers create references in their app source code to the App Insights resource. And then you can light up all sorts of useful metric and log data throughout your entire application, right down to the depths of its source code. The way App Insights historically worked is that although it used Kusto for log search, the scope was the App Insights resource itself. So that meant if you had multiple App Insights resources, you didn't have a single pane of glass, as it were, for your log search. That's still around, I think. It's called App Insights Classic. And if your developers still have older App Insights resources that are using that classic mode, you can just click a couple buttons in the Azure portal to upgrade to the current model. And the current model is where your App Insights resources go to a central log analytics workspace, which is wonderful when you think about it from a larger scope of view in terms of getting greater visibility. Let me see if there's anything left over in the slides that I wanted to make sure to mention. Well, in the name of hybrid and multi-cloud, I think I'm obligated to mention Azure Arc. Are any of you familiar or using Azure Arc services yet? It supports a few different workloads, like Kubernetes would be one, of course, SQL database in all of its forms. It looks like Postgres, but personally, I'm most interested in the Azure Arc-enabled server use case. Long story short, this is an alternative to just directly onboarding a machine into log analytics. As I mentioned, you could have your log analytics workspace in Azure, and you can load that agent on that machine, and you don't need a site-to-site VPN or an express route. It'll just communicate using TLS and on HTTPS to report into that workspace. But what Arc-enabled servers gives you is deeper governance from Azure. So you wind up onboarding your servers, whether they're in other clouds or on-prem. You run a PowerShell script or just directly install an agent called the Connected Machine Agent. Now, the confusion I want to iron out for you is that Connected Machine Agent that you use for Azure Arc to onboard your servers into Azure Arc includes the Azure Monitor agent bits in it. So you don't have to install two agents. If you know that you want to use Azure Arc and Log Analytics, you're good just by onboarding that remote machine into Azure Arc. You'll immediately be able to take advantage of monitoring through Log Analytics and those Insights modules and Kusto, as I've mentioned before. But in addition, when you've Arc enabled one of your off-cloud servers, you can do other things like taxonomic tagging, Azure policy, extensions, stuff like that. So it's just actually another very important point would be surfacing security recommendations in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Defender for Cloud can and will give you security recommendations for machines that you're monitoring in other clouds or on-prem if they're brought in as Arc-enabled resources. I think that rounds it out, Vaibhav. Any other questions in the queue, or if you want people to unmute, whatever you want.
Tim, there is a question that Shri has asked in the chat. So the question is how to charge back if we have only one log analytic workspace for all subscriptions or resources.
How to charge back? Is that the word you used?
Yes, the cost for the log analytic workspace. So if you have a single workspace at a subscription level, let's say, and it's shared across different resources which are used by different projects or different units. So how do you break apart the cost incurred by workspace?
I don't know, to be honest with you. Let's just quickly investigate that together. Azure Log Analytics pricing. I always say magic Google queries. would be Azure space search string, and then either docs or pricing. Seriously. And then if you're using something to get rid of sponsored links, which I don't think I am in this browser, unfortunately, we can get to the log analytics. I need to install uBlock Origin. Looks like that Learn has an article directly on it, though, which could be easier. Long story short, I don't know. I'll tell you what I'll do, though. I will research this at work tomorrow morning, and if I come up with a good response, I'll post it on my Twitter, Tech Trainer Tim. So if you want to keep an eye on that account tomorrow, I'll make a note so I don't forget. Let me quickly do that over here.
So can you tag a log analytic workspace, Tim?
Does it support taxonomic tags?
I don't know. I think it does support. We should be able to tag that.
Yeah, it looks like it supports taxonomic tags. Would that be helpful though? Because if you had a single workspace that was aggregating logs from multiple subscriptions.
I think that's a call that they have to take when they're designing their infrastructure, because that's a problem they will face across all the shared resources, just not log analytic workspace. How do you break apart? So in the past, I have seen where organizations just break it apart evenly across all the subscriptions, because it's very difficult to go at a granular level of how much log volume is coming from each subscription. So
yeah, that is an important discussion, isn't it? Because if you deployed a separate workspace per subscription, is that really cost effective as opposed to having a shared workspace and then using some clever logic that we need to figure out?
I think another challenge there, Tim, is I think log analytic workspace across the account level comes with a fixed 5 gig free limit. So it's not at a log analytic workspace level. I think it's at account level. So regardless if you have one workspace or 100 workspaces.
Oh, seriously? I didn't know that either. Wow.
That's what I think. I think at the account level, they monitor first 5 gigs, which is free. Once you go over that 5 gigs across your account, they start charging across your log analytic workspaces and insights, application insights as well.
Wow. Okay. One could make a pretty good career for oneself acting or as a concierge for pricing, right?
Yeah.
But they'd always be busy.
I used to work for an enterprise in the past where I created a cost report where we can tag individual costs to different business units. And man, there was no specific tool out there in the market which we can just buy, customize it, and use it. So as you said, I mean, it's a great market to be in if someone is really willing to create a product and sell it. It's worth it.
However, with the prices constantly in flux in the Microsoft Cloud Platform, you're going to be hopping almost every single day.
There should be a certification on Azure pricing.
That's one certification I might pass on, honestly, if that were to come about. Although I need it, because that is critical. Let's face it. I mean, it's probably the most critical aspect. How much is this going to cost?
I think you pointed out very rightly. I mean, on my presentations, whenever I talk about pricing about any service, I do provide that disclaimer that this was the cost at the time of preparation of this slide deck. Chances are it might have changed or it might change in future. So always look at the pricing calculator for up-to-date pricing. Cool. Looks like Chris has shared a link on querying Azure resources with attached resource tags. I think it doesn't addresses the question that Shri asked, but I think it's a good link. If anyone has any other questions or comments for Tim, please feel free to unmute yourself now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Tim is also sharing his Twitter handle on this screen right now, so you can always reach out to him as well.
Yeah.
Tim, appreciate it. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I follow you on Twitter. You helped me through AZ900 a few months ago, and I really enjoy your material. That's why I was here. So, hey, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Thank you. And congrats on AZ900. What's your next cert? Do you have another one?
At work, it looks like AZ104, but we're also being thrown into AWS world now. So I think I'm jumping that way. I work for the government, and we're looking at everything.
Right, right.
Yep.
Well, you'd certainly have your work cut out for you with 104. I think that's probably the most difficult of all the exams. But I also think that you'll be pleasantly surprised, if you aren't already, how similar AWS and Azure Resource Manager really are in most respects.
We still don't have access. We're working on our paperwork to get access to it or whatever. Some folks are setting up the networks and stuff, and I'm just a cloud ops guy or whatever. I'm not one of the architects yet. So the architects are over there screwing around, and I still don't have access. There's a very few handful of people over there playing where I'm at, and I just know it's coming. But I'm like halfway through my AZ104. You know, I have an unbelievable lab. It's almost like I have no budget. So I have an unbelievable sandbox. We're playing left and right. We're building stuff. We're breaking it. We're having a blast. And if all of a sudden if I have to drop everything to go learn AWS real quick, I'm not going to be happy.
Yeah, indeed. Capitalize on this momentum. It sounds like you're in an awesome spot.
Yeah, I would say almost, almost an awesome spot. But no, it's good. Tim, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hey, Mike, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, Tim. And quick question. Currently looking for a solution on being able to alert on Azure AD account password expiration. Wondering if something would help here or if someone knows an answer to that. I scoured on Microsoft Docs and haven't been able to find it.
Yeah.
And if not for now, maybe at some point it could be posted somewhere. That'd be great.
Yep. This again is going to be something I need to look into. Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind that can be complex and unfortunate is that the identity side uses a different API from Azure itself. Azure is ARM, and then the Microsoft Graph is the API for identity.
Yeah, I understand that. But I did. There is a way to log or sign in and audit Azure AD logs to workspaces. So I was wondering if that is able to trigger, not trigger, but use that as a way of initiating an email alert at least.
Did you say you wanted the alert definition on password expiration?
Yeah, yes, that's what I'm talking about.
I'm not sure, Mike, if we can do that because it might not be an event. Probably password change might be an event that might get logged, but I have not played around it. Tim, probably something if you can find out.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Sure thing.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Tim, for tonight's presentation. It was wonderful, lots of learning for all of us on Azure Monitor and KQL. We always appreciate you for taking out time to come and talk in our user group. And we look forward to have you again in the future. Thank you, Harbinger Partners, for sponsoring tonight's meeting. Thank you, Sammy, for joining us tonight.